Not He Who Tells. Chapter 2. The Mellow Tiger.
Apart from the name, the place bore only a fitful resemblance to the bar at the edge of the fanciful and deceased town of Castle Rock. The sort of resemblance that all small-town watering holes seem to share. And like a lot of those small, squat establishments, the Tiger seemed quite a bit larger on the inside than it had from the parking lot. The comfortable blue smell of old cigarettes smote me as I came through the breezeway. Dim booths lined one wall, separated from the bar by a scatter of tables and chairs. Behind the bar, liquor bottles sat against their mirrored reflections, casting back the brilliance of the neons and the glow of the domed Budweiser Premium, with the Clydesdales marching inside it, pulling their beer wagon perpetually around a tiny circular track. A small television mounted over the bar warbled and flashed, dominating the bar with its presence, partially drowning out the sound of Frampton on the juke. There were 7 or 8 people drifting in the midday gloom. The barkeep hovered near the TV, watching football near a roomy-eyed patron and his beer. "Well, shit," the barkeep commented to the TV. He stuffed a rag in a mug and pumped it around. His glasses flashed electric blue from the light of the screen. I took a stool halfway down the bar from the TV and clapped the book I'd brought with me onto the counter. The barkeep turned at the sound and approached, still swabbing the mug. "Can I get you?" he asked amiably. "Got any Olympia?" I asked back. It's a standard response of mine. Hardly any bars stock Olympia anymore. The barkeep flipped up the metal lid of a cooler under the bar. Cold air hissed out over a short forest of long necks. "One Olympia," he said, dealing me a coaster and clapping the mug from his other hand onto it. The bottle slid next to it with a soft clink. "Anything else?" "You serve lunch here?" I asked, surprised and pleased. "Sure, as long as you like burgers, wings, and fries. What do you have?" "It all sounds perfect," I told him, "but I think I'll work on this a bit first." "All right, give me a holler whenever you get hungry or when that empties." The barkeep drifted back to the end of the bar and went to work on another mug. I looked at the bottle in front of me, then, ignoring the mug, took a long swig from it, emptying a third. The beer was smooth and cold. When I lowered it, satisfied, I saw my face in the mirror behind the bar, peeping through the bottles of Wild Turkey and Southern Comfort. Next to the mirror, sectioning it, a polished wooden panel was hung with plaques and newspaper clippings, sections of the Daily News sports page and the local rag. Hometown boy makes good sort of stuff. One showed a grinning, impossibly handsome kid in football pads, standing on the sidelines. Something about his haircut and the cars lining the field in the background said early 70s. I smiled ruefully in the mirror. Caged history. Somebody's glory days. I cracked the book I had brought with me and laid the bookmark, a Hoyle Joker with 2 dog-eared corners, aside before taking another smaller sip of the Olympia. I had decided not to mention anything to the barkeep about the name of his establishment. The fact is, there isn't anything terribly unusual about a fictitious name appearing on a real storefront, or anywhere else for that matter. As I long ago learned from my first trademark attorney, you can't copyright a name. As if to illustrate that, there were, at last count, no less than 13 Needful Things antique stores and junk shops. There are 6 You So-and-sos, 2 Emporium Galoriums, and perhaps worst of all, 1 adult bookstore and sex toys shop in Poughkeepsie named, I shit you not, Gerald's Game. The list of those businesses came to me as a birthday present from my current trademark attorney. I had never before visited any of the establishments that bore those familiar names, and while I usually subscribe to the idea that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, I've also been just a bit secretly disturbed by it. It's strange to think that what started out as a mere whim in my head is now, completely independent of me, a concrete reality. It makes me feel like something of an accidental god. And I've come to recognize that feelings like that can become dangerous. No matter who one is, any blurring of the lines between fact and fiction is, I think, an invitation for delusion. Which is why I had pulled into the Mellow Tiger in the first place. Among that list of what my attorney had called entrepreneurial homages, there was not a single listing for a Mellow Tiger bar. Perhaps this establishment had recently come under new ownership, resulting in a name change. I sipped the Olympia again. Ah, hell, I thought. Who am I to quibble with the mediocre name choices of Mr. Cold Beer on tap? Or, for that matter, his choice of inspiring reading material. Which reminded me of the book I had carried along, sitting open on the bar in front of me. I glanced down at it, starting to read at the point where I'd had it marked. The top of the left page began, "To be construed as purely rhetorical in the context of inarguable dimensional pluralities and at least questionable interstices of ambient literals. There is an inescapable statistical probability, a necessity, in fact, that in a multi-universe of infinite dimensional strata..." I stopped reading, a mildly puzzled frown creasing my brow. This wasn't the book I had been reading the night before. That book had been called Crashing California by G. Norman Binkley, a mildly farcical dark comedy about a Depression-era family that own a San Francisco mortuary and do a remarkably, suspiciously good business with the local crime families. I was just finishing the chapter in which Uncle Otto and Sally Hammer set up the dons of two feuding mobs during a backroom poker game. At least that was where I'd left off the evening before. Until that point, Binkley had made no mention of any inarguable dimensional pluralities or interstices of ambient literals. I glanced incredulously at the first sentence again, then flipped the book over on the bar. The cover was scuffed cloth-bound with frayed edges. Gold-embossed letters, blackened with age, were pressed into it. "Diametric Translations in the Craft of Literature," or "The Myth of Fiction," by Fyodor F. Ruman. I frowned again at the cover. As far as I could recall, I had never seen this book before. Of course, that didn't mean a whole lot. My own bookcase is stuffed with volumes, both poetry and prose, fiction and otherwise, whose origins I would be hard-pressed to trace. A writer collects books the way a grandmother's refrigerator collects magnets. A few serve a carefully defined purpose, many are gifts. Most just seem to arrive there, drawn in from any number of directions and convoluted means. But even if I had grabbed the wrong book when I'd left that morning, how could I have picked up this particular strange volume? I remembered scooping the book from the pile on my bedside table. That pile, as any avid reader knows, is strictly reserved for the current top 5, the old bedtime reading hot list. This book, Mr. Ruman's work on The Myth of Fiction, even if I did own it, had certainly not been part of the current hot list. Across the floor behind me, a gust of air and light accompanied the sound of the opening door. I heard the thump of a heavy figure tromping boots on the mat. The barkeep muttered something acerbic at the TV and briskly wiped the counter. The juke paused between songs, ratcheting and whirring tiredly. I flipped the book back open again. Incredulous and bemused, I began reading again where I'd left off. There is an inescapable statistical probability, necessity, in fact, that in a universe of infinite dimensional strata, one of those stratum will contain an historical event that is, in the current temporal context, a merely fictional contrivance. In other words, that which is one dimension's fiction is by mathematical necessity another dimension's reality. Let us, for instance, examine the well-known fiction of Herman Slabowski's classic tale, The Lost Colony. Though clearly regarded as a darkly fanciful and outright horrific story of the imaginary 1640s settlement of Roanoke, West Virginia, we must assume, in accordance with the laws of simple statistics, that in some other dimensional iteration of our world, said account is an historical, if confounding, fact. Perhaps just as convincing, in our own slice of reality, do we not see embedded in history events which would, were they not true, make extremely popular fiction of a whimsical or even a ghastly nature? The partial accounts of the 1830s Welsh town of Cthulhu provide a prime, if morbid, example, and perhaps even a convincing argument for the very supposition. The question which then asserts itself is this: does the relationship between the author's fiction of one dimension and the historical reality of the other exist solely as an example of mathematical probability, or is there another, more nebulous connection? Analogously, just as the true psychic may see distant events in this world via some extranatural perception, does the author perhaps unknowingly see events outside this world from some neighboring dimension, which he then translates to the page as fiction? I propose succinctly that the actions which we call storytelling, and in its higher form fictional novelization, imply not necessarily an act of creative invention, but an interdimensional relationship between the writer and the story which imbues the one upon the other. The issue, which I shall address commencing in the next chapter, is one of ultimate origin. Does the writer create the story, which is then somehow triggered in another dimension? Or, conversely, does the reality occur elsewhere and then cause the writer to record it as story? Does the story, in some unforeseeable way, yearn to be told? When framed in this way, the classic question pendulums away from how does the writer get his ideas to the possibly less ambiguous how do the ideas get the writer? I stopped reading again and pushed the book a few inches away. It sat there open on its spine, looking incongruous on the bar top. I stared at it for a few long moments, my brow furrowed. In the alley between the bar and the liquor shelves, a thin clickety sound emerged. It tracked along the bar's length and stopped and whined at the barkeep's feet. The barkeep ignored it, his glasses still opaque blue in the light of the television. The clicking resumed around the corner of the bar and stopped at the feet of another patron. Someone mumbled a monotone at it and raked their stool on the wooden floor, reaching to pat it on the head. A gruff voice muttered, "How you doing, Radar?" The dog, a gray mongrel of indeterminate age, grinned up in response. I let my eyes drift from the dog back to the book, and then met my own gaze again between the glinting bottles of the back mirror, squinting with consternation. Where in God's earth had that book come from? The face in the mirror had no answer. I smoothed my brow and felt a growing pulse in the base of my skull, a tension headache throttling up. I made a mental note to ask the barkeep if he had any Tylenol. My eyes fell to the book again, and my hand curled loosely around my beer bottle. Where in God's earth? It read like an undergraduate philosophy textbook, the kind put into service by particularly stubborn professors with no respect for the attention handicaps of a generation weaned on YouTube and South Park. I was a professor once, of sorts, and I had required the reading of some rather clunky old texts myself. Not particularly good texts, I had to confess, at least to my wife, but necessary texts. Time-consuming texts, if you know what I mean. Perhaps Mr. Ruman's work on the myth of fiction was something I had acquired during that particular career. It was possible. Not that I had necessarily purchased it myself, nor used it in my class, of course. It had the feeling of something that could have been a gift from a student. Creative writing students, regardless of their grade or their level of actual writing ability, share certain idiosyncratic traits, not the least of which is a predilection for inflated, willfully arrogant ideas about the craft. It occurred to me that the claims and suppositions I had just read in Mr. Ruman's book amounted to no more than the philosophical culmination of that sort of arrogance. And yet it did ring with a sort of reluctant, tantalizing plausibility, didn't it? Alternate dimensions are, frankly, the bread and butter of the horror writer. Just like with science fiction, even good science fiction, horror usually depends upon the conjuring of some sort of creature from the realm of the fabled other side. It might be outer space, or the spirit world, the afterlife, or the past, the future, heaven, hell, mind, soul, or even that great granddaddy of them all, the beyond. It all amounted to the same thing. Where did the creature from the Black Lagoon come from? Where did the Phantom of the Opera disappear to? What's the address over the door of the house of the werewolf and the vampire and Freddy and Slender Man and the Gray and the Green and even that perennial all-time home run hit, the Blob? Call it the Twilight Zone, or the Outer Limits, or the Dark Side. Alternate dimensions, say science, or at least meta-science, which is good enough for an old hack like me, are all around us. They lay over and below us like a giant sandwich, layer upon layer, perhaps into infinity. Barely discernible one from the next, they say. 100 billion Earths with 100 billion subtle differences. What differences? Maybe you had tuna for lunch yesterday instead of roast beef. Maybe Elvis didn't die on the throne. Maybe the Nazis won the big WWII. Subtle differences, but perhaps reaching differences. Maybe the werewolf lives in one. Why not? Maybe the vampire. Maybe the blob. When you get right down to the sticking point, it's more than a philosophical thought experiment. It's like being kids around the campfire, listening to ghost stories, soaking in the old yarn about the hook on the door handle or the chainsaw maniac. It's scary and it's fun, but only until the part about how the chainsaw killer was never caught and he roams these very woods to this day. Only until you get back to your cabin and find some joker has gone and hung a metal hook on your doorknob. Ha ha, very funny. That's when it stops being fun. That's when it's just scary. Where? Because Mr. Ruman's rather fantastically titled book didn't leave off where it stopped being fun, or even where it stopped being technically sane. And the scary thing was the fact that it made a certain breathless sense. If in some other layer of that giant dimensional sandwich, the story, every story, is true, is it a coincidence? How could it be? How could it not be? The stories, like I said earlier, they writhe as they reach the page. Like writing with a snake dipped in ink, they writhe. Impulsively, I reached out and closed the book in front of me. I closed it on its cover, so that the blank backplate stared up at the dim ceiling. My head was gently throbbing, swishing hotly in my ears. My Adam's apple felt like a steel marble in a kid's fist. I took a large, deliberate swig of the Olympia and stifled a belch on the back of my hand. The dog, I wanted to call it Raider for some reason, but that wasn't what the guy had said, was it? Whined from the floor at the end of the bar. I heard its clickety footsteps as it crossed beneath the tables and melted into the shadows, probably to curl up in the corner behind the juke. The stool it had been sitting under raked the floor again, and I became aware again of its occupant, presumably the individual who had come in a few minutes earlier. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him gathered on the bar stool, one heavy foot propped against the rung of the bar. He was a big old galoot, hunkered on the stool like a bear on a tree stump. I wanted to turn and look at him, but didn't. The construction of most bars implicitly suggests the polite anonymity of those gathered around them. Men gather at bars like they gather at urinals. Stare straight ahead, tend to your business. But I could see his frame in the corner of the back mirror, through the reflecting bottles and the buzzing of a Schlitz neon. He was wearing a heavy avocado satin jacket with official patches on the upper sleeves, obviously a representative of the local law. His head was lowered so that I could only see a crown of dark curly hair. He appeared to be studying a notebook or ticket pad, making small tick marks here and there with a stubby red pencil. I switched my eyes away from him, meeting my own reflection again between the marching bottles of the back mirror. The cop had looked familiar. I stared at myself unseeingly for a few moments, trying to place him. Nothing clicked. I took a small swig of beer and was about to motion for the bartender to rustle me up some lunch when the cop spoke. At the sound of it, the beer in my throat tried to turn into a gasp of surprise and hitched there, uncertain which pipe to go down. I coughed, and my hand spasmed away from me, knocking my beer over with a clatter. 2 shallow slops spilled out of the mostly empty bottle. Instinctively, I grabbed the Myth of Fiction from the bar top before it could get stained. Still coughing, I reminded myself that I didn't care if this particular volume got dropped into a bonfire. I let it fall back onto the counter, still out of range of the small beer puddle, and righted the Olympia. Out of the corner of my eye, I could feel the cop staring at me, his eyes mild, like heat lamps at half power. I pretended not to notice. There was a water-stained napkin dispenser a few places down from me. I swiped a few and used them to mop up the spill, trying to look natural, noticing the interesting way my hands shook, almost vibrated as they performed this small task. Behind the bar, I could make out the shape of a green metal wastebasket half full of newspaper and crinkled wads of greasy wax paper. I lifted a shot at it with the balled-up napkins. They struck the back cupboard and dropped in. Nothing but net. 3-pointer, I muttered as if to myself. The cop was still staring, probably asking himself small-town cop questions, like, has he ever seen me before? And do I look nervous, suspicious, dangerous, anything he should be concerned about? Of course that's what he was thinking. That was his job. Or maybe he was thinking that I looked strangely familiar. Not quite like someone he's met before, like the guy he gave a drunk and disorderly to last month, or somebody from his wife's reading group. No, more like somebody he dreamed of, saw on TV, or maybe in the back of a book or something. After a few seconds, his gaze swiveled away. I felt it leave me, and an inexplicable wave of relief swept in. It was a cold relief, however, overlying something dull and nagging, a sort of mental white noise, because it was more than familiarity I sensed about the cop. Everything about him nagged at me, set off tiny alarm bells in the dark hollows of my gut. I had never met him before, I was certain of that, and yet somehow I knew him. I had almost grasped it when he spoke. Coffee tastes like it was brewed with a blowtorch, Hugh, he had said, and it was his voice that did it. I turned my head slowly, not even aware I'd meant to do so. He was studying his notebook again, turning the narrow pages slowly with one hand, the pencil tapping the bar top in the other. His face was backlit by the light of the TV. I couldn't make out his features. On his left hand, however, was a scar. It wrapped around the base of his thumb like a crescent moon. He got that scar at his grandparents' house when he was 11, I heard myself think. He got it while roughhousing with his now-deceased brother, crashing his arm through the window of the storm door on the porch. He did it during a lightning storm, back when he thought such things were exciting and fun, like giant parties in the sky. His wife called it Mr. Smiley on the second night of their honeymoon. He rubs it sometimes without knowing it. People think he's twiddling his thumbs when he does it, sitting there behind the big desk in his office with the shoplifting posters. Free ride in a police car on the corkboard and his service holster on the blotter. He doesn't think lightning storms are like parties in the sky anymore. He still sits on the back porch of his own house and watches them sometimes, but nowadays his brow is furrowed when he does it, making a storminess of its own. He tells people that he's seen it all, but he doesn't really believe it. In truth, he knows that the things he's seen are only the tip of the iceberg. He knows that 90% of that sucker is still hidden under the ocean. And perhaps more importantly, he knows there may be a lot more in that ocean than just Frank Dodd icebergs. My eyes drifted toward the sleeve of his jacket, toward the official patches stitched just below the shoulder, trying to make out the name of the city. I caught myself and jerked back to face front, pressing my lips together and reaching instinctively for something to hold on to. The reflection in the mirror met my gaze again, eyes bright like dimes, lips pressed into a pale line. A sort of breathless fright fanned out in my veins, settling in my stomach like bad alcohol. For 3 or 4 seconds, I had been in the grip of a bizarre, irrational certainty. A certainty I did not want to admit to myself, much less entertain. I dipped my eyes to the beer, which was beginning to feel sour and busy in my stomach, and then to the book. I concentrated on it, surprised and unsettled at how hard it was. The book was the real problem. It wasn't sane, not at all. Especially not to a person like me, not to a lifetime writer of freakish tales. It was full of all the wrong kinds of ideas, and while they were the sort of ideas that any third grader could refute, they were also just the sort of ideas that fit all too perfectly into the hidden sockets in the back of a writer's mind. Giving a book like that to a writer is criminally irresponsible. It's like putting matches into the hand of a would-be pyromaniac, like giving a mirror to a schizophrenic so he can talk to himself face to face. My eyes drifted again to the cop. I could just see him out of the corner of my eye, just enough to see he was looking at me out of the corner of his. Or maybe I was just imagining that. That's what guys like me do. If life isn't exciting enough, give it horns. To guys like me, the glass isn't always just half full. It's half full of premium Kentucky's finest in a murdering debutante's hand, or turpentine, or sulfuric acid, or maybe all of the above. The thought that struck me next did so with very little fuss or drama. It presented itself as mere academic curiosity, brightly and calmly. Is this what it feels like to go insane? Everything in my head stopped for a moment as if to listen. My eyes roamed over the bottles along the back mirror, then lit again on the framed newspaper clipping. The crew-cut kid in football pads smiled out at me from a bygone time. "Car accident sidelines local favorite," the headline ran. Indeed, there was some fancy rolling iron parked behind the kid, angled jauntily onto the edge of the field. The kid had probably wrecked his wheels after a few post-game beers. Coach probably told you to stay away from the alcohol, kid. You should have listened. Is this what it feels like to go insane? And then it struck me. It struck me with the perfect, simple clarity that always comes with the resolution of some nagging question that one had forgotten for the moment to agonize over. I remembered where the book had come from.